So George, when did you know you wanted to do country music for a living, and how did it actually start for you?
Had horses on it and ropes and Gene Archer's name, and it was Gene Archer guitar, and I would take that to school with me. I'd hide it out in the little patch of woods and pull leaves over it to hide it so nobody would come along.
The world had waited decades for an answer, and suddenly everything snapped into clarity. The revelation fell like a clap of thunder across quiet living rooms and humming bars alike. At first, the matter seemed already decided, irrevocably lost in the vault of half-truths, hints, and speculation. But now the final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. The mystery surrounding George Jones, once considered unsolvable, had been laid bare in all its astonishing complexity. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The sheer weight of the discovery shook even the most skeptical. For years, the barest outlines of the story floated among enthusiasts. Whispered theories, fading handwritten notes, secondhand anecdotes. Nothing formed a coherent story until now. The breakthrough came unexpectedly from a source no one had considered significant. It began with a chance encounter in a dusty archive. The kind of meeting that doesn't make headlines, but changes everything. A tattered journal passed from collector to collector and overlooked as worthless, contained the key nearly everyone had either forgotten about or assumed lost forever. That journal contained not just raw information, but the decisive confirmation of long-standing questions. Every veiled reference, every nagging contradiction, all clicked together in one startling moment of clarity. The content of the revelation was nothing less than shocking. Details emerged that rewrote what the world thought it knew about George Jones. His motivations, his personal alliances, the private struggles that had shaped his public life. Long-standing rumors came into sharp focus, newly anchored by names, dates, places previously unconnected. The narrative was transformed from myth to fact. The timing of the entry in the journal perfectly lined up with events that had baffled researchers for years. Wherever investigators had hit dead ends, this journal offered a thread, weaving them together into a tapestry of intention and consequence. It might seem strange, almost cinematic, how one hidden source can shift the ground underneath everything. But sometimes true surprises aren't crafted by conspiracy theorists or dramatized in movies. They live in plain sight, concealed by time, awaiting rediscovery. In this case, that rediscovery initiated a cascade of reinterpretation. Tens of thousands of pages of prior investigations suddenly belonged in a new context. Interpretations that once seemed airtight proved fragile when confronted with fresh evidence. And yet, despite the dramatic upheaval, a certain elegance emerged from the chaos. The newly revealed truth did more than unsettle. It also illuminated. The life and actions of George Jones gained a new dimension, reframed not by rumor but by source-based insight. To understand the impact of this is to appreciate the power of detail, the thrill of connection, the way a single document can reconfigure history. The implications resonated far beyond the confines of academic circles. For fans who revered George Jones, this wasn't just a revelation. It was a reckoning. New details about his personal trials, emotional burden, relationships, choices in love and loss, painted him in a more vivid and human light. The legendary voice now had a freshly revealed backstory, an emotional landscape rich with nuance. At the same time, this reshaping of narrative begged fresh reflection on how often myths obscure truth and how truths, once uncovered, demand a narrative capable of holding complexity without denying legacy. The sense of shock came less from betrayal than from transformation. The person each had observed in fragments, on record, on stage, through anecdotes, was now revealed in full, both flawed and magnificent. There was something compelling about the collision of reverence and reality, the way admiration deepens when grounded in honesty. If fandom often seeks purity, fascination thrives on authenticity. To trace the contours of George's life through new lens was to deepen affection, not diminish it. The broader cultural landscape shifted too. This kind of revelation speaks to a larger truth about how society treats icons. For years, George Jones had occupied a space almost immune to revision. His legend floated above scrutiny for good reason. His talent was transcendently recognized, but that also meant shadows built up. The less glamorous corners of his story were left in darkness. Now, the existence of that journal, and what it unearthed, offered a chance to integrate humanity into heroism, to replace gaiety or solemnity alone with layered truth. Museums, retrospectives, academic works, and documentaries, all those mediums that honor cultural icons, would now need to adapt. The story of George Jones would have to acknowledge the new information to remain faithful both to him and to history. That rewriting process would not be mere housekeeping. It would require rethinking narrative structure, emotional effect, thematic arcs. Scholars would need to reckon with chronology, with causality, with character. The reconstruction of his life story would shift tone and intention, compelling readers and audiences to grapple with previously hidden emotional and psychological terrain. At the same time, the very nature of the discovery highlighted the fragility and vitality of memory. That journal, private and overlooked, embodied hours of unspoken reflection, entries written under flickering lamplight and penned with trembling sincerity. The journal did more than deliver factual clarity. It embodied a presence, a voice from the past. It drew readers into the intimately personal, converting skepticism into empathy. The shock came from the resonance, the sense that history had whispered back, insisting not just on accuracy but on understanding. To finally hear George Jones in his own words, indirectly yet unmistakably, erased distances. The cadence of his inner life spoke with more potency than any mechanical transcription. And yet, fascination wasn't universal. To some, the revelation felt invasive. The notion that private thoughts, fragmented, raw, imperfect, could alter how millions perceive a cultural icon raised discomfort. There were murmurs. Should we let personal records change public perception? Do private struggles belong in legacy? Yet this debate itself underscored a vital truth, that the boundary between private and public affects how icons endure. To shy away from complexity is to flatten humanity. The impact also rippled into legal and curatorial spheres. Legal guardianship of such materials, preservation rights, even copyright considerations collided with the emotional urgency of publication. Institutions that held or had custody over the journal faced questions about access, control, interpretation. Some rushed to digitize and release facsimiles, arguing that nothing should barrier the truth. Others hesitated, citing sensitivity or the need for scholarly context. Yet each delay only amplified anticipation, intensifying the sense that, when revealed, the truth would reverberate like a chord struck deeply in collective memory. For writers and biographers, the moment offered both permission and responsibility. Permission to delve deeper, to correct missteps, to ask subtler questions. Responsibility to remain faithful both to the newly revealed facts and to the spirit of the subject. Memoirists and commentators acknowledged that their previous work would need revision. Interpretations laid on shifting sand needed to be recast in light of rock. At the same time, those without past attachments felt emboldened to approach the story with fresh perspective, unanchored by earlier assumptions. Further, the revelation disrupted more than narratives. It challenged myths about genius and suffering. George Jones had long been enveloped in mythic suffering, the tragic artist consumed by private pain made public through mournful melody. That archetype felt more real after the revelation, not less. Hidden beneath layers of rumor were specific triggers: loss, betrayal, indecision, psychological complexity. The shock was discovering how earthbound the emotional impulses were, how as frail as any human heart. It revealed how an artist's greatest expressions can be born from intimacy rather than spectacle. The emotional resonance extended to listeners as well. Songs previously taken as folklore or hyperbole came to life as confessionals. Familiar phrases were redrawn with fresh meaning. Performances once admired for vocal quality now struck a chord of heartfelt confession. Fans found themselves rewinding, listening anew, hearing the newly revealed context echo between the notes. The music spoke differently when framed by understanding. Grief, longing, regret, redemption all took on richer shades. Institutions, too, could not remain neutral. Halls of fame, preservation societies, radio retrospectives, each faced the decision: how to integrate the revelation respectfully. Some opted for special exhibits, juxtaposing journal excerpts with performance footage, trying to let evidence speak for itself. Others commissioned new narratives, essays, audio tours that embraced the complexity. The distance between myth and man contracted, and cultural stewards struggled to both honor legacy and accommodate messiness. They realized that simplification had served audience comfort, but depth would now serve truth. The scholarly community buzzed with analyses. Historians of music, culture, psychology converged on the revelation as a case study in how evidence transforms narrative. Papers emerged exploring how the journal reshaped understandings of mid-20th century country music and its stars. Research into archival bias, into what stories survive and why, gained new momentum. This single document became emblematic of a larger reckoning, the need to seek, uncover, and confront the truth, regardless of how it changes beloved figures. Unexpected allies emerged around the revelation. Writers and performers who had long observed, or wrestled with, the mythology of George Jones began to speak more openly about their own relationships to messy legacies. They compared the moment to other icon unburdenings, when beloved figures were reframed not to diminish them, but to humanize them. In that act of reframing, they saw the work of redemption and deeper connection. At the same time, skepticism lingered in places. Some questioned authenticity. Could this be a forgery, or a misconstrued translation, or a misinterpretation? But the evidence, painstakingly vetted through handwriting analysis, paper dating, cross-referencing with known correspondences, proved overwhelming. Specialists in archival science confirmed the lineage of ownership and the integrity of the text, and peer-reviewed processes carried the findings beyond dispute. The shock then shifted from disbelief to amazement at how meticulous scholarship had unlocked a voice long dormant. In workshops and writing classrooms, the revelation became a teaching moment. Students read not just for acclaim, but for conflict, for unsaid tension, for the places where the human hides. The life of George Jones, already a lesson in performance and affect, now became a lesson in narrative caution, in humility. That nuance, once discovered, asks us not to worship less, but to understand more deeply. Throughout, the dramatic moment held a simple power, the shock of truth made flesh, coming from where it seemed least likely. It was not a staged unveiling, not a sensational broadcast, but the quiet opening of a fragile leather binding. That contrast was part of the allure. The world had braced for press conferences and bombshells, but the bombshell was soft, intimate, the turning of a page. As finality settled in, readers and listeners and scholars felt themselves adjusting posture. There was no going back, but no point in resisting. Recognition came that complexity breeds resilience. And so the shock softened into reflection, then into deeper admiration. The myth of George Jones, the legend, stood untouched. The man was now more present than ever, more tangible, more heartbreakingly real. In that presence lay the true triumph. The revelation did not undo the legend. It did not spark ruin, but renewal. Houses of memory rearranged themselves. Songs echoed richer. Stories, once fragmentary, now wove themselves into a fuller tapestry. George Jones remained a towering figure, but one grounded in flesh and heartbeat. A figure worthy not solely of worship, but of conversation. That very tension, the meeting of reverence and revelation, became the final, most thrilling proof of something greater. That legacy only gains depth when allowed to carry its own shadow. The real gravity of the George Jones mystery being solved did not truly sink in until the secondary discoveries began to unfold, unexpected ripples from the initial breakthrough. Once that journal was authenticated and studied in depth, researchers began mapping the new revelations against the wider network of events, places, and people connected to his life. This mapping exposed threads of influence that had gone unnoticed for decades, not because they were entirely hidden, but because the missing context had prevented anyone from recognizing their significance. The most striking realization came from the precision of dates. George Jones's career was punctuated by moments that seemed, on the surface, coincidental. Album releases aligning with personal milestones, sudden changes in style or lyrical content without apparent provocation. With the new evidence, each of these transitions took on deeper meaning. A shift in the tone of his music that had been previously chalked up to evolving artistic preference could now be traced to a precise chain of personal events, decisions, and turning points. These connections added layers of intentionality to his career arc, revealing him as not just a gifted vocalist, but a deliberate storyteller whose life and art were intertwined more closely than anyone had realized. The names uncovered in the journal also opened new avenues of exploration. Some were familiar, collaborators, friends, and family members long associated with him, but others were complete surprises. These unexpected names led to further research, uncovering meetings, exchanges, and even brief partnerships that had never been publicized. They painted a portrait of a man whose personal network was far wider and more diverse than the public narrative had allowed. Each name hinted at moments where influence flowed both ways, George absorbing from others and leaving his mark in return. The resulting image was of an artist not sealed off in the isolation of fame, but actively, almost restlessly, engaged with a range of creative and personal circles. Perhaps most shocking of all was how this new understanding reframed some of his most celebrated performances. Audiences had long revered his ability to convey pain, longing, and vulnerability with a single note, but without context. The emotions had been interpreted as artistic projection. Now, the link between specific songs and actual events in his life gave those performances a startling intimacy. Some live renditions, once simply admired for their vocal precision, could now be recognized as moments where he was, in real time, processing private truths in front of thousands. That awareness reframed not only the artistry, but the courage it must have taken to put such raw emotion into the public sphere without revealing the source. The discovery also transformed how historians viewed the dynamics of the music industry during his era. Archival contracts, touring schedules, and recording session notes, when re-examined alongside the new material, revealed a series of calculated risks. At multiple points in his career, George Jones had navigated pressures from producers, label executives, and promoters, balancing commercial demands with personal convictions. The journal exposed the rationale behind certain seemingly inexplicable choices, declining high-profile opportunities, insisting on specific arrangements, delaying projects despite intense pressure to deliver. These decisions, once considered stubborn or erratic, now appeared as deliberate acts of self-preservation or artistic integrity. Even the places associated with his life gained new significance. Towns and venues that had once been footnotes in his biography now emerged as pivotal settings for turning points. Small recording studios, anonymous roadside motels, even quiet fishing spots by the water, all became stages where decisions were made that altered the trajectory of his life and career. Local histories began to integrate these revelations, elevating ordinary landmarks into sites of cultural memory. Fans, scholars, and even casual tourists would now see these places differently, understanding them as the backdrop for moments of profound personal and creative significance. Another layer of intrigue emerged in the form of coded language within the journal. Not every entry was explicit. Some were marked by metaphor, private shorthand, or symbols that seemed opaque at first glance. Decoding these passages required careful comparison with known events, letters, and interviews. In some cases, the codes appeared to protect sensitive information about other people in his life, while in others they seemed designed to allow him to express truths he couldn't confront in plain language. This cryptic aspect lent the journal an additional air of mystery, reminding researchers that even as they uncovered shocking details, some parts of George Jones's inner life might remain forever just out of reach. The revelation also had profound implications for understanding collaboration in his body of work. The traditional narrative often placed George as the lone genius in the center, with supporting players in the periphery. However, the new material suggested that he often sought and valued the creative input of those around him, sometimes going to extraordinary lengths to incorporate their ideas while ensuring they received little to no public credit. This approach both protected them from industry politics and allowed him to integrate diverse influences into his music without compromising his own brand. It was a quieter kind of generosity, invisible until this moment, that altered the moral texture of his professional identity. Cultural critics quickly began noting how the revelations about George Jones fit into broader patterns of how history treats creative icons. Too often, they argued, public narratives either lionize or vilify, with little tolerance for the in-between spaces where humanity actually resides. George's newly uncovered truth was a reminder that the very elements that make an artist relatable, the struggles, the contradictions, the quiet acts of resilience, are often the first to be erased in the quest to preserve an idealized image. By restoring these elements to the narrative, the story not only became more accurate but also more inspiring in a raw and unvarnished way. This reevaluation had a secondary effect. It reshaped the way listeners experienced his music across time. Younger generations who had not grown up during his career's height now had a new entry point into his work, one rooted in the authenticity of his lived experience. Streaming playlists began to reflect thematic groupings inspired by the revelations, allowing listeners to follow arcs of emotion and narrative that had previously been invisible. Even casual fans found themselves re-listening to familiar tracks with an entirely different emotional register, catching subtle inflections and lyrical turns they had missed before. The emotional impact of this renewed context reached beyond fans and historians. Fellow musicians, many of whom had quietly cited George Jones as an influence, found themselves revisiting their own creative choices. Some spoke of feeling liberated by the reminder that vulnerability need not be hidden from one's work, that honesty, even when painful, can deepen the connection between artist and audience. In this way, the solving of the George Jones mystery began to ripple forward into new works, inspiring projects that might never have been conceived without it. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the George Jones mystery? What do you expect happened? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.